That thing quiet.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining in to our 2020 crop tour wrap up. We are trying out our first webinar, so thank you for taking the time and joining us. We obviously would love to see you in person and have your bright smiling faces in front of us, but we're all adapting to different ways these days. So thank you again. I'm Melissa from Swiderski Equipment, and we were fortunate to once again this year, for the third year in a row, host a field plot, our crop tour project, and we have some great partners that have helped us through this. I'd like to actually say thank you to Pioneer and the Cropping Central crew from the Edgar area who has partnered with us the last 3 years. We've had great partnership with Precision Planting, AGCO from White Planters and Massey Tractors, and of course we're proud to be part of the project too. So just a couple of quick notes for you. We will take questions at the end, so feel free to type them in the chat. On the bottom of your screen there's a toolbar with a chat option, so you can type in the chat, and you can also text in questions if you would like to. The number to text is 715-551-1457. I will also write that in the chat for you, but feel free to text us any questions you may have. We'll go through the presentation and then take all those questions at the end. So I'm going to turn things over. Actually, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Mike Gronsky, field agronomist with Pioneer. He's been a part of the crop tour project from the beginning. And John Cooper, who is the precision farming manager here at Swiderski Equipment. So I will let them take over.
Wonderful. You got to change your view there, Melissa.
I do.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks, Melissa. Welcome everyone to our crop tour for this season. And basically what we're going to be looking at doing today is give a recap of what we did for 2020. We're also going to incorporate some of the trials that we conducted in 18 and 19 just to kind of show the variation in yield that we saw with different growing seasons during different conditions at planting and throughout the course of the year. So as we start this crop tour, I mean, our goal has been every year, start dating back to 2018, is getting the most yield potential that we can out of our acres by looking at optimizing our planter settings, and with our goal being, you know, top end yields and seeing where we can continue to gain. Ultimately, to get here, it starts here. You know, as we continue to look at the furrow, seedbed prep, tillage, and most importantly, what a lot of our agronomic trials are focused on is just the planter setup itself. So I mean, as we get to that point, you know, we need to understand things that we can be doing to the planter to potentially add yield potential to our crop. So as we look at the furrow itself, there's a lot of different things that go into factor of what affects our yield, what affects emergence. Population, singulation, depth, compaction, soil moisture, temperature, furrow residue and uniformity, organic matter, and most importantly, seed to soil contact are some of the biggest things, in addition to closing up that furrow once we've got that created. These are all factors that play into the yield potential that we're going to be able to take with our crop. So with that, we're going to click to the next piece here and just have John talk a little bit about some of the things that tie into that factor.
Well, here at Swiderski, we're a premier precision planting dealer, and there's several products that come down the line as far as how to control and monitor these things with the population, singulation, depth, compaction, you know, everything on that list that you see there. Pop them up. But as far as populations, we got the V-set, the V-drives, depth and compaction. We got the Delta Force cylinders. We get into moisture, temperature, organic matter, things of that sort. We have the Smart Firmer. And then we obviously get to closing the furrow at the tail end of it with our FurrowForce options.
Thanks, John. So a little overview on the plot. As Melissa mentioned, you know, we've been doing this since 2018. This is a group effort between Swiderski Equipment, Precision Planting, White Planters, obviously Pioneer, and then the Cropping Central group from Edgar, who is one of our local Pioneer sales representatives. In 2018, we ran 8 different trials. That was all focused completely on corn. 2019 was a little different. We ran 10 trials, but we were working with both corn and soybeans. And for the 2020 season, we did 9 trials, same thing, corn and soybeans once again. Both in 2018 and 2019, everything that we did was weighed with a weigh wagon. For 2020, just because the corn trials were a little larger in size, we decided to go the route of using our yield monitor data. The yield monitor on the combine was calibrated as we went in doing these trials, and just felt it was a way to take out some of the complexity and speed things up a little bit during harvest. So that's how the data was pulled together here as we finished up. So looking back at the growing seasons and how things worked out, 2019 was kind of an interesting year, and I just want to compare and contrast a little bit because there were some big differences between the two seasons. 19 was a season that would never really stop raining. So as you look at this chart here, I mean, you see we had all these lines in purple basically highlight days where we had significantly higher rainfall events than one would expect. We were just about 6 inches of rain above the 20-year average, and 10 more than in the 2018 when we had the drought. So we really had a lot of rain. We basically planted wet and stayed wet for the entire season, which was kind of a challenge. As we look at GDU-wise in 2019, that was another interesting challenge. As you look at that, you can see that we had lower amounts of GDUs through prolonged periods of the growing season, but we were able to make some of that up later in the year as we continued to get heat without a frost. That being said, we finished just about 252 behind 18, and we were just a little bit behind the 20-year average as we finished out the year. So as we look at 2020, what did things look like? We learned a lot of different things. And the first thing is I think, everyone and myself included, we were all probably a little apprehensive about getting going planting. Things were cool. I mean, as we looked at the conditions, probably some of the driest planting conditions that we've ever seen in recent memory, but soil temperatures were, kind of right at that fringe line of wanting to plant. One takeaway that I'd say that we learned from it is that, if it's dry, we can plant cool. That was really a nice takeaway that we saw. Basically timely rains as we got through early June into that July time frame, but then the rain kind of tapered off. We started to pick up some rain later again in August. GDU wise, we really didn't hit a home run at all. When you look at when our frost occurred in September, really we ended up about 70 behind the 20-year average. So it was a pretty decent growing year for the most part. Would have been nice to have a little more heat on the back end. Would have been nice for a little more rain in that June to July timeframe. But from a standpoint of planting a crop and having a good season, really it was some of the nicest conditions I've ever seen in the spring in my 12 years being involved on the agronomy front. So with that, John, you want to tell us a little bit about the planter and what we had going on there?
Sure. So the planter that we chose to use this year was a 9816 VE white planter. Comes factory with the VSET V drive or VSET 2 V drive Delta Force. We added the clean sweep, the V-Apply HD for the fertilizer row-by-row control. We also installed a Smart Firmer to monitor organic matter, moisture, temperature, things like that. We had a FurrowForce system installed, a manual FurrowForce system to try out the closing. And then we also had the Keaton seed firmers for seed to soil contact.
So for 2020, our focus on soybeans, the biggest thing that we focused on was white mold management. This continues to be a challenge for us in north central Wisconsin, and we focus around 3 variables that are a hot topic when it comes to white mold management. We looked at population, row spacing, and fungicide were the 3 variables that we incorporated into our trial. Then we also looked at depth and downforce just to continue to broaden our horizons as far as our base data. So with that, you want to tell us a little bit about the downforce system on that planter, John?
Yeah, so one of the crucial things on a corn planter, most important things when it comes to it, is the management of your downforce. So what we have installed on here is our Delta Force system, which we get from Precision Planting, comes standard on the white planter. But what it does is give you the ability to take off weight and add weight to keep your depth consistent without compacting the sidewall or losing that ground contact. So you have even emergence throughout the field.
So with our downforce trials, we did those in both corn and soybeans this year. Obviously, we're going to talk about the soybean one first. We ran 3 different settings. The auto setting was obviously what John described, where basically it's running and changing the amount of down pressure applied based on varying ground conditions that are detected. The light setting is basically running only about 60 pounds applied to each row unit. That'd be similar to a scenario if we had an older planter that maybe was a spring style or maybe had no downforce and maybe was running with just a partially filled seed hopper and not applying enough downforce to the row. And then heavy, basically trying to simulate that scenario where we're over applying, planting into maybe a wetter condition. Maybe we have, bushel and a half seed boxes heaped to the top, and we're actually over applying the amount of downforce. So as you look at the photos here, it's really kind of interesting. You look at the auto versus the light comparison, and you can tell, we were at planting, I would say our moisture was pretty adequate. It was dry and cool, but it wasn't exceptionally dry. And you look at the photos here, you still saw more consistent emergence and vigor on the auto versus the light. And the same thing as you look at the comparison of the heavy versus the auto, you can see that we had a more uniform stand getting out of the ground and really kind of shined when you started taking photos of these next to one another. As the season progressed, it was interesting. I tried to work and get photos throughout the course of the year. It's always tricky as summer seems to go faster than we ever could imagine. And in these photos here, it's interesting. So you look at like the light downforce, and those soybeans actually caught up a little bit later in the season. And you can tell as we look at them here, we underapplied. In the photo could be a little bit better, and for that I apologize. But they're getting a little bit more lodgy as we're getting closer to harvest. They put more growth and development on as the season went on. As we look at the auto setting, I felt that they were standing reasonably well as we were getting later into the growth and development stages. And the heavy, you can actually see, as they were slow out of the ground at emergence, which was shown in the previous picture, they never really put on as much growth and development as the auto setting. So as we fast forward, go ahead, John.
And I just interject a little bit here. The great thing about that system too, as well as, for testing purposes, we put a heavy to simulate them heavy and a light. But you got ranges anybody, there is an auto setting, but in certain situations, you can pick the setting that you want in the conditions you're in if one of them do not suit you. So
good point, John. So with that, we've got yield data from both 2019 and 2020 here, just kind of comparing and contrasting what that looked like. As we look back at 2019, that was, kind of an interesting scenario. As I mentioned earlier, when we talked about the weather, we started out, basically we were kind of on the wet side at planting and stayed in moisture all season. And as you can see, the auto pressure, the auto downforce, prevailed and was the best treatment for that given season, followed by the heavy, and the light ended up being the worst. And at the end of the day, I think we were given some forgiveness on the heavy setting simply because we never really ran out of rain. And as we fast forward to this year, we look at 2020, the same thing, was shown here. The auto setting continued to add the most yield advantage to what we were doing on the soybean front. But even in scenarios where, we planted into a nice dry condition, the heavy setting still ended up being our best. So a couple nice takeaways that I see here is one is that, the auto is still excelling either over or under applying the amount of down pressure that we're putting on our row units. There's still a significant gain to be had on the auto versus the light, especially. And really, as I look at, soybeans especially, and it's going to change a little bit when we talk about the corn data, what we're starting to see as a trend is that over applying down pressure tends to be more of a non-limiting factor versus under applying down pressure on the row unit. So with that, next we're going to hop into our planting depth. And as we look at the planting depth, basically what we did this year, we did anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 2 inch and 1/2 inch increments, just trying to simulate finding that ideal planting depth. I know as we've continued to change from soybeans and go away from drills, we've tried to improve the consistency that we see. As you look at the trial, some of these photos here after emergence, we've got the 1.5 inch versus 1 inch and the 2 versus 1.5 inch. And you can see that, that the inch setting was really pretty consistent out of the ground with the 1.5 inch. There wasn't a lot of variation that we saw there. As we looked at the 2 inch versus the 1.5 inch, there certainly was some delayed emergence that we saw with those deeper planting depths, especially early on in the season. As we got into the later parts of the season, the shallower planting depths, so the 1/2 inch or even the inch, they really kind of flew out of the ground initially, and we were seeing more growth and development on them throughout the course of the season. The challenge becomes as we got closer to harvest, as you can see in the photos here, is that the soybeans themselves, had a lot more lodging in them than what we were seeing in some of these other treatments. And as I click forward to this next slide, you'll see the 1.5 inch planting depth and the 2 inch planting depth. You can see that those plants didn't put on as much growth and development. And the other factor that I would say is you look at that 2 inch planting depth, you can tell it actually slowed down the rate of maturity on those soybeans. They were a couple days behind on emergence out of the gate. And you can see they're not maturing quite as quick versus the other 3 planter depth settings that we ran here for the 2020 growing season. As we look at comparing and contrasting planting depths across the course of 2 years here, we've got the 2019 data shown on the left. And as you can see, the 1 inch depth really led the way for us, followed by that 1.5 inch planting depth. And then as we look ahead to the 2020 season, it was basically the same trend. 1 inch planting depth was where we wanted to be on target, and the 1.5 inch depth was following shortly behind. So as we look at that, there was just about, even with 1 1.5 inches being close proximity in terms of yield potential, there was still right around a $26.50 acre yield advantage across the 2 seasons when you average that out, which, that's quite a bit when you look at what that can add up to. And on those white planters, John, how do you guys set up that depth from the factory? How does that make that unique?
Good question, Mike. So the nice thing about our depth control on the white planter is it's calibratable. So when you start the season off, you're able to set the machine down on a flat surface and calibrate that so that the T handle on the back, 1 inch is 1 inch, 2 inches, 2 inch, and every 1/4 inch in between, it matches up across the whole planter. So you're not guessing what each row's depth is at that point.
Great. So with that then, the last piece of the soybean trials that we ran this year, we did a white mold management study. That was a combination of population along with row spacing in conjunction with some fungicide. But before we hop into that, I just wanted to rewind and take a quick look at 2019 and what we saw. 2019, we just ran a straight population trial in 30-inch rows. That season, we ran 40, 80, 120, and 160,000 respectively. The interesting part is we looked at the yield potential that we took out of 2019. The best yielding trial that we actually ran was the 120,000 treatment in 2019. And as you look at 2019, it was a unique year. I mean, I remember when I was doing stand counts on these given trials that year after what I would consider a less than desirable spring, it was kind of on the cool and wet side. We were seeing stand reductions somewhere in that 15, 20% in some instances, even what I would consider ground that you normally wouldn't expect to see that on. That being said, the 120 prevailed as the best yielding trial. But when we start factoring in the additional seed cost of another 40,000 seeds per acre, when you look at 80,000, that was just a tick behind on yield. When we factor in the best ROI, the best return on our investment, considering we bought 40,000 less seeds per acre to attain the given yield, was actually the 80,000 treatment in 2019. So what about 2020? What did that trial look like and how did we do that? So we compared both 15 and 30-inch row spacings. We planted them at all 4 populations at 40, 80, 120, and 160,000 respectively. And then the last component is that we worked in an approach fungicide pass. And what we ended up doing is we did not apply any approach to the northern half of the field, but the southern half of the field we applied approach to. That's a product that's been known for helping with white mold management and preventing. And then also it is effective on other foliar diseases and soybeans as well. That was applied at that R3 time frame, which would be defined as a 3/16-inch pod in one of the 4 uppermost nodes of that soybean plant. So with that, we're going to walk through just some of the observations that we took throughout the course of the season and see what we have there. So first off, we're just looking at various populations. We've got 120 versus 80 and 160 versus 120 in these 2 given photos that are here. And the interesting thing that I tell you to look at is you look at each given population. We had good stands this spring. We were obtaining 95+% of our targeted planting population. That being said, as you look at this, when you can see where we're planting at lower populations, those plants aren't competing as much with one another, and you're not seeing as much early growth and development on those. And as you continue to ramp up that population to that 120, 160 mark, you can see these plants are actively competing with one another and really starting to stretch out ahead of their counterparts at lower populations. So from there, fast forward to some of our later season photos that we had. This was the 40,000, and these were all the 30-inch treatments, the photos that we're going to reference here. 40,000 with fungicide application versus the 80,000. And as you can see, I mean, they're both standing relatively well, not a lot of lodging, things look pretty good. We advanced to 120,000, starting to see a little bit of lodging in the plants themselves. And then the last piece here is we look at 160,000, you could find pockets in there that had significant amounts of lodging as we continue to walk through there. So basically, as we up that population, we were continuing to see more lodging was basically the trend that we saw. In summary here, as we look at some of the takeaways that we had just from a population standpoint this year, and I'm going to dissect this a little bit further as we had the row spacing piece involved along with the fungicide. 80,000 had the top yield and obviously the top return on our investment for the season. And that being said, I think the reason that we watched that slide past the 120, I mean, we had all of our stand, we had great emergence, things came together very well. And that, in second year running, that was our best ROI. First year that it was the top yield. 120 came in second with our best ROI and yield. But the interesting thing that I want to point out, and I've said for a long time, I feel like we're overplanting our soybeans. And if so, if you look at our 160,000 plant per acre management decision, and factor in that you would have planted an additional and paid for an additional 80,000 seeds per acre, that was an $80 an acre management decision that would not have worked out in your favor when you look at the combination of lost yield along with additional soybeans planted. So you're really, as we continue to plant soybeans earlier and look for more yield potential, what we're finding is that less is more. As we look at early season soybeans, less, planting at a lower population, they're going to put on more vegetative growth. If we can plant a lower population, they won't have quite as much vegetative growth as we would expect to have, versus if we overpopulate them. And, the other factor too, and kind of a disclaimer I want to throw out here, I know we're playing with some low populations and I keep getting back to this 80,000. When we do these trials, we have ground that has been worked well, it's been rolled. We are planting with a fully loaded precision planter.
And just to interject here, we have a 56-hole disc that can singulate that soybean just like a corn crop or a corn seed at that, under 140,000 or less population.
Absolutely. And in addition to that too, we are using fully treated seed to protect all those seedlings early on in the year. So with that, then just a couple other summaries, because I mentioned we had the row spacing by population along with the fungicide. When we averaged all the 30-inch spacings versus all of the 15-inch combinations at all 4 populations, 30 inches offered just about an additional bushel per acre. When we looked at approach treatments, we averaged all approach and all populations row spacings versus without. We were just about 1.36 bushel better with the approach. As you can see, those numbers are broke down below, it was greater than a bushel and a half in the 15s, and it was closer to just a bushel in the 30-inch. Now, the question often will come up is, well, how come we didn't see a bigger response, with the approach, or why wouldn't we have gotten more out of that fungicide? So if we look back at the weather that we had, as we were heading into that approach treatment, we were right on that line of having ideal amounts of moisture, and then we were starting to get on the dry side. As I look at what I saw this approach trial, is this what I would normally expect to see? Honestly, not. I would have expected more yield potential to be had. That being said, as I visit, I have other sales reps I work with across the area, and there were other areas where growers ran approach trials on their own, and we were seeing more of that 6, 7, 8 bushel when we weren't running out of moisture in that July and August timeframe. So sometimes we do these things and, Mother Nature just doesn't cooperate to let us see the fullest yield potential that might potentially happen. Just a quick overview, you can see a couple trends here. This is just all the individual treatments broke out on this bar graph here. And as you can see, that sweet spot kind of coming into that 80 to 120K mark in both row spacings and pieced out with the approach. And this stuff will be available later. Melissa and Dayton are going to work on making this available for folks to look at. So it's just kind of a busy slide here. So with that, we're going to hop into the 2020 crop focus piece that was done on corn. For this season, we did planting depth. We also did downforce and singulation again. In addition to that, we had an opportunity to play with Precision's latest innovation in FurrowForce. And then we also did a standard versus high management block for 2020. So with that, the first piece here, we start out with the singulation, and basically what we're trying to do is put together 99 versus a 95% singulation. And John, you want to tell us a little bit about how we did that?
Yeah, so what we're able to do is take one of the discs, the 27 cell disc for corn, and make what they call a goof plate out of it. So to simulate a skip, we would plug a couple of the holes off, and to simulate a double, we'd drill the extra holes, and then we drill a hole to misplace seed. The nice thing about this disc is even with the skips, you're still holding the population with the extra holes for the misplaced seeds that we put in.
Yeah. So this is a trial that we've been running since the beginning. Initially, the first year we ran this was in 2018. We actually did a couple replications of each. And the comment I'd make is that this will vary a little bit by hybrid genetics and settings. So you're going to see some interesting numbers. The first year we did this with Pioneer 9188. That's a product that's listed to have a little bit less flex as far as kernel size goes. That being said, even as we looked at the variation of a 95 versus 99%, there's still just about a 2 bushel gain. I feel like that hybrid actually has a little more flex than we give it credit for, but still was you take a couple bushel times $4 corn times 500 acres, these are numbers that add up in a hurry.
If we look back at the season though too, we see that we had an excellent growing season. I mean, things were, I wouldn't say perfect, but they were excellent growing conditions. And to see just that little bit of, that little bit of response, even in a good year, is awesome.
Yeah. So then as we fast forward and look at the 2019 and 2020 data where we replicated that, in this situation, we just ran replication of each. So the interesting thing is you're probably looking at the 2019 data going, well, how did the 95,000 treatment, actually 95% singulation exceed the 99% singulation? And the answer was, we look back at that season, we planted a hybrid in 9120 that is a very fixed-yeared product. And actually what we found is that we really didn't lose any seeds on a given thousandth of an acre. So we actually ended up with more plants. It kept raining throughout the course of that season. So even though some of these plants were closer proximity than what we would like them to be, they ended up having more yield potential than what one would expect. And it actually kind of reversed on us by a couple of bushel. As we fast forward to 2020 and look at what we saw there, this was a year where it basically did what I would expect it to do. We saw, a variation. There was about 1,000 less plants per acre that was observed with the 95% singulation versus the 99. And come harvest time, there was a 3 bushel variation to be gained on the given treatment by having ideal singulation. And the other comment I'd make too is just looking at, in my experience in agronomy, often when, even if on an older plant year, we take our meter off and take it in to have it ran, often our singulation's not coming back at that 95% mark. I've seen some 90s, some 85s, and even less in some instances where these meters have been very neglected. So, really, I think, in all fairness, I don't think this is very representative of what a more worn out planter component would actually bring yield wise. So with that, then we hop to the planting depth piece. This is a project that we've been running all 3 years. When we started in the initial year, we actually ran all from a 1/2 inch all the way out to 3.5 inches at 1/2 inch increments. The last 2 seasons we did this, we just capped it at 3 inches. Same thing though, we did it in 1/2 inch increments again. So as we look at what we're trying to accomplish here, 2018 from a planting depth style, yields were really pretty consistent once we got to the 1 inch mark. We didn't see a ton of variation, but we were seeing more yield potential in some of the deeper depths. Once again, we look at 2018, we planted in reasonably decent soil conditions, but then we got dry late in the season. So that's where we really started to see that variation in terms of yield potential, as that plant was not rooted down very well. And that plant, these shallower planted depths were showing significantly more drought stress as we got through that rough period there in August into September when we were lacking moisture. 2019, that was a completely different year. We stayed wet the whole time. As we look at the yield potential that we saw in 2019, the sweet spot basically fell at that 2 to 2.5 inch mark. And where I find that to be an interesting comment is, when you look at, often I get that question, do I need to not plant deep when things are cool or wetter, or what should I be doing there? And really, at the end of the day, even in a year where we had less than ideal conditions at planting and we continue to stay wet, that 2 inch, 2.5 inch mark really seemed to favor what we were looking for as far as planting depth, and then also the yield that we were able to take away at the end of the year. As we fast forward to 2020, little different looking scenario here. Yields were relatively consistent with the exception, the 1/2 inch and the 3 inch depth that kind of fell off again. I'll be honest, the 217 bushel at 1 inch where it really ended up being our best treatment. Sometimes you just can't explain things when you do a trial, and I'm kind of at a loss for it. Looking at the growing season that we had and the fact that we got dry through August, I would have expected that to taper off more with the 1/2 inch treatment. The only thing I can think of is maybe there was some unforeseen factor that was not noticed as we were going through the growing season or at harvest. But I would have expected, that more of that 2 to 2.5 inch. But the one comment I would make is if you throw that out and say that that was potentially a bad strip of data taken, once again, you get in that 1.5 inch, 2.5 range things. The consistency really comes yield wise. And with that too, there's some new technology from Precision that's going to be able to allow us to actually vary some of that depth, correct?
Yeah. The new product that was released this year for sale is now called Smart Depth. So Smart Depth, the premise behind that is to plant into 30% moisture. So with a Smart Depth system, you're able to set your parameters on your minimum depth, your maximum depth, and it will search anywhere in between to hit that 30% moisture to get your emergence out of the ground fast.
Sweet. Excited to check some of that out. So next up, we'll hop ahead to downforce here. John talked about that a little bit earlier on soybeans and the parameters that we ran. Same parameters were applied here in corn. And as we look at, I'm going to click through these kind of quick here, but 2018, as we looked at it, the auto down setting was actually a tick behind the lighter downforce. And if you look at what the 2018 season was, it was kind of an interesting year. Planting conditions were, the 3 years we've done this, they were second best. But then we got really dry later in the season. So in instances here where we over applied downforce In this instance, the auto, arguably maybe did a little more than we wanted to. The light downforce actually was the prevailing winner, not by a lot versus the auto, only by a little bit better than a bushel. But as we look at 2019, things changed. That was a wet year all the way throughout. As you look at that here, the light setting really fell off pace. The auto setting led the way by a bushel over the heavy and 2 versus the light. And then heavy fell in second. And even though that spring we were observing some sidewall smearing and some hatchet rooting on those plants, those plants really didn't have to have a root system that was as aggressive or as robust as you would like to have ideally, because we had moisture to complement it. 2020, we've talked about that. Started out nice and dry, but it was cool. We had timely rains, got a little dry. Auto led the way again. As we looked at where we came in yield potential, offered just about a 3 bushel yield advantage over the heavy versus the light. We actually brought home 9 bushel more. So really the moral of the story, as you look at 19 and 20 is once again, as the trend that we see is that if we're going to apply downforce, really a little more is better than not enough. And especially under ideal planting conditions. You look at 2020, did we over apply in a situation that could have led to hatchet roots or limited growth? Certainly, but we planted dry, and that was where we were forgiven for that. And we only saw a 3 bushel variation from the auto versus the heavy setting. So with that, we're going to hop into our next trial here. And John, I want you to just take a minute here and tell us a little bit about FurrowForce and what that technology does and how that works.
This is basically the precision plantings closing system they come out. As far out on the market, it's one of the best out on the market, probably in my eyes, the best one out on the market. So what it is it's a 2-stage closing system. So it's got a set of discs in the front part that will close the bottom half of the seed trench, and then it comes with a trailing wheel that's kind of split, and it'll close the top half. In an automatic situation, you can run an automatic manual. In our testing, we did a manual application, but in an automatic application, there's a sensor, there's a pin in there that tells you what kind of force you're applying to that ground, and it adjusts to them varying conditions, just holding enough margin to close that consistently. We showed some pictures earlier in the slides that showed that where the double V, you could see exactly where you were. Whereas you can see in this video, as you're coming across and you see a behind view, you can't even tell where that seed trench is anymore. It's hard to find seeds after you've seen this go through.
Yeah, that was probably the most frustrating thing this spring is I'm digging around trying to find seeds and potentially see how the crop is germinating and where we're at as far as proximity to emergence. And it really was a lot bigger challenge than I expected to be.
So
but that was a cool challenge in my mind.
The cool thing about it is when you do a cross-section view of that, you take a spade and you come down, you pull back. You can't even tell you've been there. Everything's nice and crumbled and put together well. So
cool. So with that, we're going to hop ahead here and talk a little bit about some of the trials. So this is a picture here that I got in the springtime. And the interesting thing is this was still when we were in adequate moisture in the spring. On the left was without FurrowForce. It was just your standard double rubber closing wheel system. And on the right was with FurrowForce. So that was just a manual setting on the planter. As you look at the 2 different trials, the interesting thing I see is even as we were in good moisture, without the FurrowForce, we would still see that consistent crack where that furrow would be. And the other thing that was really unique is I was watching plants emerge on the FurrowForce trial. Normally we normally see that corn come up exactly in a row because it's coming up in that trench that's still basically there, as John talked about when we start digging. With that trench being almost non-existent, that plant itself didn't have the easiest route to find its way through the soil and emerge. And you actually saw that the plants, while the growth and development was consistent coming out of the ground, they'd actually be anywhere from a quarter to even a half inch off center from where that initial trench would have been before FurrowForce essentially brought it to an end. As we look at other factors with the FurrowForce here, the interesting thing is you look at the year here, we ran 2 replications. So we did 2 planter passes with FurrowForce, 2 without. At the end of the day, we saw a 2 bushel advantage with FurrowForce, and we were a 1/4 point drier across those treatments. Now, the comment that I would make though is these were the best planting conditions I've ever experienced in my 12 years of doing this, right? So for those of you that have seen me do winter crop shops, I somehow always take 2 to 3 slides and talk about ideal seed to soil contact, good soil conditions, and everyone looks at me because I'm talking about this mirage that really never exists in spring in north central Wisconsin. We found the mirage in 2020. The ground conditions were dry. We had ideal tillage. We had ground that just crumbled in your hands. And the other factor too, we didn't have, no residue to deal with. We were on corn following soybeans. We had just about every ideal scenario possible come to fruition, and we still gained a couple bushel. So the comment I would make is I would think about what that looks like, in an operation where we've got more clay content. We were on some very nice Roselville Fenwood soils, versus being on like a Loyal or a Withy or some of the heavier clays as we get south of Marshfield. What happens for our corn on corn scenarios, manure, heavy amounts of traffic that occurs while we're doing some of those passes. So, I know it doesn't seem like a significant yield, but I think it is, just considering that, really there weren't any true challenges given to this given field.
I agree. I've been doing this a long time, 10 plus years, and this is probably one of the best years we've ever had for conditions out in the field. So it's amazing to see that even you're still gaining bushels even in a perfect year. So
right. So with that, then just talk a little bit. We did for everyone that joined us this summer, you had an opportunity to see our high management and our low management blocks. I shouldn't say low, more standard management is what we were going for, just to be more representative of what we see typically. So here are just a couple of the variations that we did between the blocks. We bumped the seeding rate up 2,000 plants per acre. We did an additional band of 1034-0 with a little ATS and some UAN versus nothing in the lower management block. The V5 side dress, we did 45 gallons, just a one pass in the low management, and we only did a 25 gallon rate in the high. And then the side dress, we didn't do any late season side dress on the tassel application for the low management. And the high management, we did our last 25 gallons. And then we did also incorporate a fungicide application of that high management block as well. Basically, we needed to try and come up with another $100 per acre to make this high management block come to basically work out monetary wise. At the end of the day, we only brought home 13 bushel, $4 corn. That's going to put us at $52 per acre. We were basically at that cost level per bushel or value to sell the crop. We would have needed another 12 bushel to break even. So the question really becomes, where did we go backwards? What did we do wrong? And I guess a couple comments I would make is, one, as I look at part of it was a protocol that we probably put together initially out of the gate, was that we had more nitrogen there than typically I felt like a standard acre would see. Nitrogen wise, we were on soybeans, and then we were closing in closer to 170 pounds, and I feel like that should have been cut back some. That was, it's all hindsight 2020. The other factor that I'd like to comment on too is that, while I see a lot of value in multiple passes of nitrogen throughout the course of the season, this year I don't feel like we were able to reap as much of a benefit of that, simply because, we look at that low management block. Yeah, we put all our nitrogen on early, but we never got these heavy pounding rains after that to leach that nitrogen out of that soil profile and away from the root system of that plant. So we basically got some forgiveness for that low management block. Other factors I would mention too, as I look at the fungicide application that we did I see value in that? Yes. As we got to the harvest time frame, I thought plant health was better. I thought standability was better. The drawback was, though, we did it to a hybrid that had an exceptionally good plant disease rating, and really disease overall for 2020 was pretty low. And then once we made that application, we went into that dry spell. So unfortunately, we just didn't see as much of a return as we probably would have liked to have seen there. And then the last piece of the pie, as we look at it, we just kind of ran out of rain. We had some yields that I viewed as acceptable for what we were trying to do. But it really, in that area we were, if we would have been 10 miles north or 10 miles south, and been able to pick up a little more rain, I feel like we would have seen a little bit bigger variation between those two given treatments as well. So with that, basically we're to the conclusions piece here. And really the biggest takeaway that I would like to say here on that side is, there's a lot of technology out there. There's lots of different things that you can add to your planter, or lots of things you can add to a new planter to bring yield potential home. That being said, it still takes time of getting out of the tractor. As you get going in the springtime, even if you're planting with an older unit, there's a lot of yield to be had simply by getting out of that tractor, taking a walk around your planter, digging some seeds, and seeing what's going right, what's going wrong, and how those changes can be made. And really, the biggest theme here is seed to soil contact is king. As we can continue to improve that and continue to improve placement, we're really going to find ourselves on the right side of the table.
And I agree with that, Mike. I mean, we can offer you a lot of technologies to help you be efficient, get it in the ground right, but there's still that you want to do the checks, you want to make sure everything is doing what it's intended to do, and that's where we come in to help you accomplish that, and to do these things year after year to make sure that what we're helping you with is actually doing what it's intended to do. So
Cool.
All right. Thanks,
Melissa?
guys. Yeah. So a lot of good information that we learned. I just want to mention again, so if you have any questions, we've got a little time here that we're going to take some questions, and I have received a couple. So I'm going to ask you guys some, but again, the number 715-551-1457 that you can text your questions as well as type them in the chat. So really great opportunity though for us, like Cooper said, John said, to put our money where our mouth is, right? Why do we do a field plot? Why does an equipment dealer care to do an agronomy field plot? And for us, it just allows us that opportunity to put that equipment to the test. And what's really cool is we've been able to do this 3 years in the same location. So we can drive results year over year. I do want to say a special thank you to Kevin Nijakuski, who has hosted this, was a huge part of getting the project up and going, and was gracious enough to allow us to play around with this field,
Right.
play around with some seed and put this together over the 3 years. So thanks, Kevin. But just adds a lot of value to have 3 years of data, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And going forward, we're going to be continuing to do this, and there'll be more details to come about what the plans look like for 2021, but we have a few things cooking. So I would encourage you to stay tuned and just see some of that stuff as we start unveiling that going forward.
So I'm going to start with a few questions that I did receive already for you guys, and then we'll take some more as they come. But the first question we got, so, we've heard, and you talked a lot about bushels per acre, but how does this translate for the dairy producer where the majority of his crop's going for silage?
So that's a good question, Melissa. So as we start looking at, from the dairy standpoint, we look at everything in tons, right? We're looking at tons of silage that we collect off an acre and we can take home and feed back to the girls. So as we look at a conversion rate, typically every ton of silage, you're looking at basically 7 to 8 bushel of corn to make that happen. So, any of those, as Melissa and Dayton share these slides later on, when you look at those bushel numbers, use that formula to calculate that back to tonnage. The other comment I'd make is, in Pioneer, so back in the year that I joined Pioneer it would have been 2017 was my first actual summer, we did some flag studies where we looked at essentially the effective emergence on quality of silage. We did it in kind of small plot work and thousands of an acre, and then we would harvest these plants individually, shred them, send them in. And the more interesting thing, we always knew that we were losing yield on late emerging plants, but the bigger thing that stood out is how much it affected the quality. It wasn't just the lack of starch that showed up, but we actually watched digestibilities continue to slide down on these later emerging plants. So that's something that, a lot of this revolved around today was consistent emergence and getting things out of the ground, and really at the end of the day, to make the best quality cow chow, we still want to get that crop out of the ground just as uniform if we were a grain farmer.
And part of that goes to the equipment setup too, doesn't it, Cooper?
yeah, and just being out there and listening to some dairy guys, I hear the comment all the time that, well, we're just making forage for cows, and I'm like, well, wouldn't you want a machine that can and follow the steps to put that in right and get the best you can get out of it for that cow? That's what it comes down to at the end of the day, I think.
For sure. Okay, we have a question on the soybean plot that we received too. So as we look back just 15, maybe 20 years ago, a lot of guys were planting 1 to 2 bags per acre of soybeans. How have we lowered population so quickly in such a small amount of time?
Well, there's a few factors that tie in why we're able to plant so much less versus what we were in the past. And I think the first thing that we look at is, one, I think we have a better understanding of what our seedbed prep needs to look at. Tillage as a whole and just my 12 years in agronomy has improved a lot, and we have a better understanding of what that seedbed needs to look like versus trying to force things. One other factor that I look at too on the population stand front and why we're able to continue to reduce is just what we're planting with. You go back 15, 20 years ago, we drilled a lot of soybeans. And not saying that a drill is a bad tool, it's still a viable piece of equipment on the farm. But you look at what it does, and we don't get that consistency with our depth. And often when we're planting soybeans in that manner, if you're not seeing some soybeans that get left on top, we're probably planting too deep. So really, we were overpopulating to compensate for what the equipment wasn't doing in our favor. The other factor that I think ties into this that's ever more so important, and I mentioned a little bit during our presentation today is the added benefits of seed treatment. You know, seed treatment really protects that investment versus 15, 20 years ago. We planted a lot of raw soybeans yet across north central Wisconsin, and seed treatment has become basically a staple to prevent early season seedling diseases. So I think that's really the last piece. And, you know, I mean, I look at, you know, even some of the worst case scenarios, you go back to 2019 when we did our trials, you know, even under pretty much miserable conditions in my mind in the spring, you know, we still had 85% of our targeted population that we planted. This year, we were almost perfect. I've done other trials too, where we've been on good ground and go out there at harvest and 100,000 was planted of treated seed, good conditions, good planter setup, and you're finding 95, 97,000 plants per acre. So we've come a long ways in a short period of time.
I think that's one of the, over the last 2 years, though, we've heard from growers or our customers that that's surprising information they get out of the plat from us, that you don't need to be at that as high a population as what they've always assumed they need to be at. So
absolutely. I mean, just the things I've gotten, you know, they're planting that high population of 160, 180,000 to get that 120, 140 stand, you know. What I've seen, I mean, what I've seen in the last couple of years is singulating that seed and planting that lower population has come a long way. So,
and one other comment I should have added, but also just looking at how much more white mold pressure that we have. If you go back 15 to 20 years ago, we had very little white mold pressure. It wasn't really talked about. We really weren't looking at ways to manage it in our given area. But as we continue to have this heavier soybean rotation, where it's every other year corn soy on a lot of these acres, you know, we're going to continue to build up the sclerotia in our soil and have higher potential for more white mold. So as we're doing that, planting lower populations actually help us as we have less vegetative growth, we have better airflow through the canopy, and we're not losing bushels to the yield itself.
So one other question we received, and I feel like we get this a lot this time of year. This isn't a new question for us, I don't think, but you know, I guess, Cooper, if a customer is not capable of purchasing a brand new planter this year, but they want to make upgrades for 2021, where can they start to get their current planter set up?
I mean, the best thing to start is to have a conversation with one of our specialists here at Swiderski Equipment, in my opinion. I mean, we offer several things that you can do to your current planter to get you, you know, maybe 1 year down the road, 2 years down the road, until you can get that new corn planter. And it's as simple as starting with a good seed sensing system. You know, we offer 2020s, and you can put it on an existing planter and you can see exactly what your planter is doing. And it paints a pretty clear picture of what you can do to improve on, and then you can build on that. But at the end of the day, get one of us involved, and we can surely sit down with you and see what's best for what you have currently.
Absolutely. The folks from Swiderski are well versed in doing a planter walk around and helping you find bushels. In the same breath, our Pioneer sales staff, they've been all of our local reps, they've been trained to know what to look for on your planter and how to help find yield there. So feel free to reach out to them. And another handy tool also, if you go on pioneer.com, we actually have a planter setup basically guide to kind of talk about where you should be looking at as far as wear points and things you could be doing to protect yield before you put the planter in the ground this spring.
So doesn't look like we have any other questions. I guess any other final thoughts from you guys?
Spring's coming fast.
Scary reality. January's almost done, you know, really, and you know, basically 75 days from now, we could be starting to get the itch to start thinking about maybe scratching some dirt if we have a decent year. So I guess think warm, think dry, and you know, if you have more questions that come to mind, both mine and Cooper's emails are on the screen here. So if you have something that you'd like to ask offline, you know, feel free to email either one of us and be happy to answer anything that you might have beyond today.
We really appreciate everyone tuning in. Again, this has been just a neat project for us to get off going, neat partnership for different areas to help you, you know, get a better end result. That's the goal for all of us. So again, we just want to say, you know, from Swiderski Equipment and Pioneer, thank you. Again, we've had Cropping Central, AGCO with White Planters and Massey Tractors, Precision Planting for being great partners over the last few years. Thank you to Kevin Idzikowski for hosting this. We've had some additional help too. Adam Bauman from Twin Bee has helped us over the last few years in several different aspects, from planting to harvest. With combining as well. So we appreciate, you know, the help that we've had, and please stay tuned. As Mike mentioned, we are going to make the handouts available in an electronic format. So if you visit seicroptour.com, we will have that handout there. We also recorded this. So if anyone missed any information or you'd like to look back or maybe want to share this with a neighbor, feel free. We will have this video posted as well. Again, seicroptour.com. And stay tuned for updates of our 2021 plans and some new exciting things that we'll be testing out for the year. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Spring.